Welcome to 6.7. We're going to now use what we've learned in Chapter 6 about factoring to solve equations. These are called quadratic equations. That just means we're dealing with an x squared. Don't worry about that terminology. So first off, let me introduce something called the zero product rule. This is really critical to what we're going to do. The zero product rule says if I have two things that multiply together to equal 0, then I can guarantee that one of them has to be 0, A or B. Please note, this rule is not true for anything besides 0. This is only true for 0. So, with that in mind, let me just quickly show you how this works. Notice here, I have x minus 2 and x plus 3 are equal to 0. So since they're both equal to, since the product is equal to 0, the zero product rule means that I can go ahead and break that apart. And I can say that either x minus 2 is equal to 0 or x plus 3 is equal to 0. And then I can just solve each equation. So how do you solve this one? Hopefully you're saying I add 2. How do I solve this one? I can subtract 3. So x is positive 2 or negative 3. And sometimes your computer, another way to write it, if you look in the book, is they do a combination, do a comma, the two numbers separated by a comma. That's another way to do it. Just realize that's it. And sometimes they'll say the set of solutions. They're just asking for these numbers down here. Okay. All right. With that armed, let's move on just how to solve by factoring in general. So hint, this is going to involve factoring. So we're going to solve this. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to pause the video and I want you to factor that left-hand side, x squared plus 14x plus 45. I want you to pause the video and factor that. All right, so hopefully you factored it. If you did the AC method, you break up the middle term into 9x and 5x, because 9 times 5 is 45. They add up to 14. And you end up with x plus 5 times x plus 9 equal to 0. So again, we can now employ the zero product rule. And so we have x plus 5 is equal to 0, or x plus 9 is equal to 0. Can you solve each of those equations? Go ahead and pause the video and solve them. Well, hopefully you solved and you got x is equal to negative 9 or negative 5, or we can write them together in this way. So this is how we solve by factoring. We have it equal to 0, we factor, we set each factor equal to 0, and we're done. So let's try that on this one. Can you factor this and solve it by factoring? Go ahead and pause the video and try to solve this by factoring and using the zero product rule. Well, welcome back. When you're factoring this, if you do the AC method, 13 will break into positive 16 and negative 3. And you can factor that all the way down into 4x minus 3 and x plus 4. Okay. Now you can set each of those equal to 0 and solve them. You end up with x is negative 4 or it's positive 3/4. I'm going to write it that way. Now, real quickly, here's a quick comment. You can always check your answer. How? Well, what would happen if I took negative 4 and plugged it back into my original equation for x? Hopefully, if I did it right, that would end up being equal to 0. Same with 3/4. So you can always do that to double check your work in the end. You can always take your answers and plug them back in. Let's move on to example 4. How can we solve this by factoring? Well, hint, I'm going to need to factor it. So I'm going to pause the video and factor that left-hand side. Well, hopefully you looked at it and realized the first thing to factor is the greatest common factor. X, and we get x minus 5. Now we can set each of those equal to 0. And we have x equals 0 or x minus 5 equals 0. Well, x equals 0 is done. We've already solved that one. The other one is just x equals 5, so our answers are it's 0 or positive 5. And you can, again, plug those in, double check. Let's try another one. This one. Can you factor that left-hand side? Go ahead and pause the video and try to solve that by factoring. Welcome back. Hopefully you recognize this is a difference of squares, so we can use that rule. We get 2x minus 5 and 2x plus 5. Again, set them equal to 0 and solve them, and you're going to have with x is 5/2 or x is negative 5/2. So notice they're very similar, but one's positive and one's negative, very much like how difference of squares works. Let's try another one. And so now we're gonna add another layer to it. What is different with this equation? I'm even gonna write there in black for you. Hopefully you're saying it's not equal to 0. So how could I make it equal 0? Well, hopefully you recognize I can subtract 10 from both sides, and then it's equal to 0. Now that it's equal to 0, I can attack it like all the other problems. So go ahead and pause the video and factor this to solve it. All right, as you did that, hopefully, and notice I broke it in negative 23 and negative 25 and positive 2x. And we get all this down to x minus 5 and x and 5x plus 2. Set each one of those equal to 0. And so our answers are x is equal to 5 or x equals negative 2/5. Well, this idea, but notice what was the critical first step that we had to do? We're using zero product rule, which means it has to equal 0. It has to equal 0. If it's not equal to 0, you cannot solve by factoring in the current format. You got to move it over to get it equal to 0. Well, with that in mind, let's try this one. How would you solve this as it currently stands? Go ahead and pause the video and try to think your way through it, and then I'll come back, but I want you to attempt it first. Go ahead. Well, hopefully you said, well, it's not equal to 0. But before I can even move that 30 over, what if we multiplied out the x minus 3 and the x plus 8? If we did that, you're going to get x squared plus 5x minus 24. Now we can move that 30 by adding 30 to both sides, and we get x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. So again, we want it to be equal to 0 and want to be something that I can then factor. Do not try to just use the very first form because we can't solve this necessarily. It's not equal to 0. So go ahead and pause the video and work through this from here on. Okay, hopefully you factored this one. It factors into x plus 3 and x plus 2. Set each one equal to 0, and we end up with x equal to negative 3 and x equals negative 2. So that is how we solve by factoring. Keep that in mind as you continue to go through these problems and build them line upon line. That what it's about is setting it equal 0 and using your factoring. Hopefully, as a final comment, you recognize this is why your factoring skills are important, at least for this section. They're going to come up more in future chapters. So make sure you get this down for this section, or it's going to cause a lot of trouble, to be entirely honest. Good luck. Please let me know if you have any questions.